Good morning and welcome to Little by Little, a short time in God's Word. It's Monday, and so we are turning once again to our study from Calvary Chapel, Port Angeles on Sunday morning from the book of Esther. We're in Esther chapter 2. To watch this sermon, go to calvarypa.org, latest message. You can also find it on YouTube. And so Esther chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. So when it says after these things, you might think, oh, just after the big party and that Vashti didn't come, and how the wise men said we should not let her come into the king anymore, and we'll get a new king, a new queen. And he was like, yes. Drunken decisions, never good. And after these things, actually, there's a 4-year gap between chapter 1 and chapter 2, where the reason for all these parties and banquets in chapter 1 was to draw up support for his attack on Greece, and those did not go well. And so he kind of returns back to Persia with his tail between his legs, frustrated, angry, humiliated, and just in a bad place. And so it says he remembered Vashti after his anger had abated, and you wonder, did he wish he'd done something different? And that happens. We make decisions, and sometimes if we're continually making decisions when we're angry, there's a looking back, wishing we hadn't done, wishing we hadn't said. And so if you're in that place, it's time to take stock. It's time to ask the Lord for help to allow the anger to dissipate before you make decisions. And on Vashti's side, are you willing, like she was, to hold fast to what is true and right, even in the face of job loss? So we continue. The king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdoms to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. When her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young woman to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So there's a lot in that section that we talked about in the message. Just a couple highlights for us this morning. Mordecai is a Jew, and we're told that when it comes to Esther, she is told by Mordecai not to reveal that she's a Jew, and so that will come into play later in the book. Mordecai was an older man at this point, and an older cousin of Esther, raising her. He was taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. So time period wise, it means he's 80 plus years old, likely at this point. It's been somewhere between 60 and 80 years since that happened. So he's not a young guy, but he's still raising Hadassah, or Esther, and looking out for her. And through this competition, this pageant, she is taken, and we're told that she is beautiful. And so after that, then she quickly gains favor of those who are in charge of the woman. And God is using this event, even this, a pageant. You're like, how can God use this? A bunch of women that are going to spend one night with, how can God use that? Well, God is always at work. And that's just the thing. He's at work, not just in the extraordinary, but in the ordinary, in the mundane, everyday things of life. It's up to us to be on guard and to be looking to see where God's at work. And the good thing is you can join him in where he's at work. And so as Esther's there, she's gaining favor because of just her character, her virtue, and God is bringing her closer and closer to raising her up. So when it came time for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go in to the king. No, sorry, go back. Verse 12. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the woman, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she had desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the woman, advised. Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. God promotes Esther. And of course we know the famous saying, for such a time as this. Well, that's not that time yet, but God's putting her in place. And he's got her in the right place for the purposes that he has planned for her and to use her for. And he's got you in the right place for whatever it is that he's going to do in and through your life and for those around you. And he's got Mordecai in the right place, as we'll see at the end of the chapter. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. He was in the right place at the right time. Just as Esther was placed where she was for promotion and to be the queen, Mordecai was where he was to do what God had him do. He didn't get the same acclaim, the same praise at this point in time, but he did what was before him. What's before you today? What's God put in your sphere of influence? Who's he put around you to minister to? Till next time, little by little.